So if you've ever walked into like a massive centuries-old cathedral or stood in front of a sprawling Renaissance fresco, you probably have this built-in assumption about how art and architecture evolve.
Right, yeah. We're taught to view it as this very slow, almost agonizingly gradual crawl.
Exactly. Like a century of trial and error just to figure out a slightly better archway, you know?
Oh, absolutely. Or another 200 years to finally master the blending of pigments.
Yeah. It's supposed to be this slow burn, generation after generation laying down one brick of progress at a time.
But the traditional narrative is just, well, it's heavily linear. You start with something rudimentary, and through a massive span of time, it just incrementally inches towards sophistication.
But then you start looking into the early Islamic world, and that entire timeline just shatters.
It really does. It completely falls apart.
Right, the slow burn becomes a flash powder explosion.
Yeah.
I mean, we aren't looking at an evolution here. We were looking at a creative shockwave.
A shockwave that transformed a civilization's relationship with beauty almost overnight.
Exactly. So I've been buried in this incredibly dense but fascinating material all week for this deep dive. I'm primarily pulling from Volume 2 of a text called A History of Muslim Philosophy.
Specifically, their section on the fine arts, right?
Yep, Part 2, the fine arts. And, the sheer velocity of this cultural leap is staggering.
It really is. We're talking about moving from the most severe utilitarian survival structures in the desert to some of the most sophisticated art forms in human history.
And mathematically brilliant art forms, too.
Oh, exactly. And doing it at an unprecedented speed, all while navigating incredibly strict theological constraints.
Which is wild to think about. You would normally assume that strict religious rules about, like, what you can and cannot depict would stifle creativity.
Right, or at least slow it down significantly.
Yeah. But here, we see those exact constraints acting as a pressure cooker. It's like it birthed entirely new ways of visually and audibly processing reality.
And the fascinating part is that it didn't just stay in one region. This synthesized aesthetic spread from the Atlantic coast of Spain all the way into the imperial courts of China.
Okay, so, to the listener, if we want to really understand how a civilization completely rewrites its visual vocabulary, we have to start with the baseline, right?
We definitely do. We have to look at the architecture.
Because the starting point is incredibly stark. I mean, before Islam, the Arabian Peninsula is not exactly a hotbed of monumental building.
Not at all. It was largely a culture of survival, completely adapted to a very harsh, unforgiving environment.
Right. The population was mostly divided between the people of the tense nomadic tribes living under camel hair cloth and settled populations living in mud brick hovels.
There was absolutely no imperial grandeur to inherit in the Hijaz region. I mean, to give you a concrete sense of this, just look at the very first sanctuary in Mecca.
The one used by the Prophet Muhammad.
Yes, exactly. It wasn't a soaring temple. It was essentially just a small, roofless, oblong enclosure.
Like just four walls.
Just four walls made of rough stones, laid entirely dry without any mortar. And it was built just slightly taller than a human being around the sacred well of Zamzam.
Wow. And even when the community migrates to Medina and the Prophet builds a home for his family, it remains radically humble.
Incredibly humble. And that home actually served as the first real gathering place for the community.
Right. The historical records describe it as an enclosure of mud bricks, maybe 100 cubits square.
Yeah, and the portico, the shaded area, was literally just palm trunks shoved into the ground to act as columns.
Supporting a roof made of, what, palm leaves and mud?
Palm leaves and mud, exactly. The interior rooms were partitioned off with palm branches, and the doors weren't even heavy wooden structures.
They were just curtains of black haircloth, right?
Yes, if you stood inside, you could reach up and just touch the roof.
Which tells us so much about the early psychological and social priorities of this movement. I mean, this was the home of a leader whose influence was rapidly expanding across the peninsula.
But there is zero attempt to project power through physical scale.
Exactly. Contrast that with the Byzantine or Sasanian emperors of the same era. They were projecting their divine right to rule through massive marble domes and sprawling palace complexes.
While in early Islam, the architecture was purely functional. It was just a space to gather out of the sun.
The focus was entirely on the message, the community, and the moral order, not on the aesthetic container.
But, as you said earlier, that completely flips within a single human lifetime.
This is what I mean by the timeline shattering. Fast forward just a few decades, the Muslim community has expanded outward, conquering vast territories of the former Byzantine and Sasanian empires.
And suddenly, in 691 AD, under the Caliph Abd al-Malik, we get the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem.
And this isn't just a slightly bigger mud brick building. This is a mathematical marvel.
It is an absolute quantum leap. The Dome of the Rock represents the exact moment Muslim architecture realizes it needs a public face.
A monumental presence to stand alongside the great Christian basilicas of the Levant.
Right. But rather than just copying a basilica, they engineered something entirely unique.
Yeah, it's an annular building designed in concentric rings.
At the center, you have a wooden dome sitting on a high drum, which rests on a circle of 4 massive piers and 12 columns.
But the space around that central circle was too wide to just throw a roof over with the wooden beams they had available.
Right. They couldn't just build a circle inside a square. They had to step it out.
So they enclosed that inner circle within a massive octagon over 20 meters on a side.
But to bridge the gap and support the roof over the ambulatory, the walking space, they had to build another intermediate octagon between the outer wall and the inner circle.
Which creates these 2 concentric ambulatories. And, this wasn't just an arbitrary design choice. It was highly functional.
It was designed specifically to facilitate the tawaf, the ritual of circling the sacred rock.
But here is the architectural flex that really caught my attention in the reading. If you just drop 2 octagons around a circle, you're going to end up with a forest of columns blocking your line of sight.
It would feel like a maze.
Exactly. It would be super claustrophobic. So the architect did something completely brilliant. They gave the central ring of columns a twist.
A very precise 21-degree twist relative to the outer octagons.
Right. And that isn't just a quirk of the blueprint. That 21-degree twist is a highly advanced optical calculation.
What it means in practical terms is that if you enter through any of the 4 outer doors, you don't just stare into a stone pillar.
Your line of sight is perfectly preserved. The columns of the inner rings frame your view straight across the building to the central column on the far side.
It takes this highly structured, tightly packed geometric form and makes it feel infinite and unobstructed from the ground level.
It's just a masterful manipulation of space, and it shows an incredibly rapid mastery of geometry applied to human perception.
And we also have to talk about the surface treatment because they completely abandoned that austere mud brick aesthetic.
Oh yeah, the exterior was originally heavily paneled with marble.
And the upper portions were completely covered in fisa intricate glass mosaics.
Which is mind-blowing. I mean, we've gone from black haircloth curtains to optically calculated concentric octagons covered in glowing glass mosaics in roughly 60 years.
And the Umayyad dynasty, who are ruling from Syria at this time, they just keep pushing this envelope.
Right. Abd al-Malik's son, al-Walid, decides Damascus needs a defining architectural statement.
So he commissions the Great Mosque. And this site is perhaps one of the most fascinating case studies in how cultures layer on top of each other.
Because when the Muslim armies took Damascus, they didn't just clear-cut the city.
No, they inherited an ancient sacred enclosure, a massive walled area called a temenos.
And originally that held a Roman temple dedicated to Jupiter, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
and later the Byzantines converted it into a Christian church dedicated to John the Baptist.
And for a period of time after the Islamic conquest, Muslims and Christians actually shared this exact same physical space.
Which is one of those historical details that sounds like fiction but isn't.
I know. You had people entering through the same main gate, and then the Christians would turn left to go to their church, and the Muslims would turn right to their prayer area.
It speaks to a level of early pragmatic coexistence. But eventually, as the empire solidified its power and wealth, al-Walid wanted a dedicated monumental space.
So he negotiated with the Christian community, brought them out, and then demolished the interior structures.
Leaving only the ancient outer walls and the old Greek watchtowers at the corners.
And those watchtowers, interestingly enough, were repurposed to become the very first minarets.
Exactly. And what he builds inside those walls is breathtaking. A vast courtyard surrounded by porticos, a massive sanctuary over 130 meters long with tiered arches.
And the mosaics, I mean, they didn't just use a few accents of glass, they covered the walls.
There was this golden vine scroll frieze and massive depictions of landscapes and architecture.
When it was newly finished, it's estimated that the surface area of the mosaics was the largest of any single building on Earth.
It was absolutely considered one of the wonders of the medieval world. But what's crucial here is recognizing the synthesis taking place.
Right, because the Umayyads didn't invent cut stone masonry or glass mosaics out of thin air.
No, they absorbed the local Byzantine and Syrian craft traditions. They hired the local artisans.
But they repurposed those techniques to serve a completely new religious and social function.
Yes,
Okay, but I want to push back on something here.
go for it.
If they are just absorbing local talent like Byzantine mosaicists, Syrian stonecutters, and literally building inside the walls of Roman temples, how does this not just become a messy architectural Frankenstein?
That's a really good question.
Like, how did they maintain a unique identity? Why doesn't the Great Mosque of Damascus just look like a slightly tweaked Byzantine church?
That is the central tension of early Islamic art. The answer lies in the functional requirements of the religion itself.
So the function dictates the form.
Exactly. The hardware, the stone, the glass, the specific curve of an arch might be local, but the operating system was universally Islamic.
Ah, I like that analogy.
Regardless of where you were building, the community needed a vast, open courtyard to gather for Friday prayers without the segmented aisles and heavy altars of a church.
They needed a very specific orientation, right? The building had to face Mecca, marked by the mihrab, the prayer niche.
Yes. And they needed a way to call the community to prayer, which birthed the minaret. So the local artisans had to adapt their traditional masonry and mosaic skills to fulfill this new spatial and liturgical blueprint.
That makes total sense. The underlying purpose organizes the borrowed aesthetic into something brand new.
Precisely. The function dictated a unifying structure that transcended the local materials.
But everything we've talked about so far, the Dome of the Rock, the Great Mosque, these are highly public religious spaces.
Right.
And the traditional narrative tells us that this culture was strictly puritanical. But when you look at their secular buildings, like the palaces they built out in the desert, that narrative gets incredibly complicated.
You are referring to the Umayyad desert castles, places like Qasr Amra in modern-day Jordan.
Yes, and these sites completely disrupt our assumptions about early Islamic austerity.
They absolutely do.
I was reading the descriptions of Qasr Amra, and it sounds like a Roman emperor's weekend retreat.
It pretty much was. It has a full bathhouse complex with hypocausts.
That's the underfloor heating system, right? Where they pumped hot air from a furnace through channels under the floor and up through the walls.
Exactly. But it's the walls themselves that are truly shocking. They are covered in frescoes.
Painting after painting of human figures.
These frescoes are absolutely vital to art historians because they show us what was happening behind closed doors. You have scenes of hunting, depictions of craftsmen at work.
And even images of singing girls and dancers, right?
Yes.
There's one room where the dome over the hot bath is painted to look like the vault of heaven, complete with the constellations and the signs of the zodiac.
And most brazenly, they painted portraits of the rival kings they had conquered.
Like the Byzantine Caesar, the Visigothic king of Spain, the Persian emperor.
It's essentially a massive painted victory lap in a private bathhouse.
It is an unabashed display of secular power and luxury. What does this reveal about their rules on art?
It reveals that during the Umayyad period, the strict theological hostility toward painting living figures, which we know becomes a defining feature of Islamic art later on, had either not fully crystallized yet, or it simply wasn't strictly enforced in the private secular lives of the ruling elite.
The Syrian Hellenistic influence, which loved figurative art, was still deeply ingrained in the culture they had conquered.
And the rulers clearly enjoyed it in private.
So there was this massive dichotomy between the public piety of the mosque and the private luxury of the palace.
Very much so. But this whole Syrian-flavored era doesn't last. The political winds shift violently.
Right. The Umayyads are overthrown by the Abbasid dynasty, and the entire center of gravity of the empire moves eastward from Syria to Iraq.
And with that geographical shift, the architecture completely changes its DNA.
The Abbasids move the capital to Baghdad and later to Samarra.
And by moving east, they step directly into the cultural footprint of the ancient Persian empires, specifically the Sasanians.
The building materials change immediately, don't they?
Oh, completely. We leave behind the finely cut stone and marble of Syria and the Mediterranean, and we go back to brick.
Often just baked mud brick, which sounds like a downgrade, but they handled it in a way that made it feel incredibly imposing.
Exactly. Because mud brick isn't visually striking on its own, they began covering it in thick, massive coats of stucco.
And they would carve that stucco with incredibly intricate repeating patterns.
But the most defining feature of this Abbasid period is the sheer, overwhelming scale. Everything becomes monumental, and they introduce highly rigorous axial planning.
You have palace complexes with vast courtyards, soaring domed throne rooms.
And everything is laid out on massive symmetrical
The
grids.
scale is almost hard to comprehend. Take the Great Mosque of Samarra, built by the Caliph al-Mutawakkil.
The outer walls form a rectangle that covers nearly 38,000 square meters.
But the thing that truly captures the imagination is the minaret standing outside that wall, the mawiyah.
Yes, the spiral minaret.
It doesn't look like a tower. It looks like a monument to geometry. It's 50 meters high, and instead of stairs inside, it has a massive ramp that winds counterclockwise around the outside, getting steeper and steeper as it approaches the top.
Malwiya is the ultimate expression of this new imperial aesthetic. It is monolithic. It is entirely distinct from the earlier Syrian or Byzantine forms.
And it radiates absolute, unquestionable power.
It's a structure designed to be seen from miles across the flat Iraqi plains.
Yeah, what's fascinating is how this new Abbasid style, this art of Samarra, becomes an export. Because the empire is so vast, you have people moving across and bringing these new trends with them.
The perfect example of that is Abd ibn Tulun.
Right. He was originally a Turkish slave who was raised and educated in the sprawling palaces of Samarra.
Eventually, he rises through the ranks, is sent to Egypt as a governor, and effectively establishes himself as an independent ruler.
And when he decides to build his new capital in Cairo, he doesn't build in the local Egyptian style.
No, he essentially imports Samarra to the Nile.
Right. He builds palaces with golden halls and this massive mosque that is said to have cost 120,000 dinars.
He uses brick piers instead of columns. He uses the carved stucco rosettes, the pointed arches, all hallmarks of Iraq.
And his minaret. It's basically a direct homage to the spiral mawiyah he grew up seeing in Samarra.
This is a recurring theme when you study the physical history of this era. The migration of architectural styles follows the migration of political power and military movement.
We see it push even further west into North Africa, too.
Yes, the ruler in Kairouan, in modern-day Tunisia, wanted to upgrade his great mosque. He didn't just emulate the Iraqi style, he literally imported the materials.
He shipped in marble panels and these brilliant 21-centimeter square luster-painted tiles directly from Baghdad to decorate the wall around his mihrab.
So Iraq is exporting its aesthetic across North Africa.
But then there's Spain. Spain is this incredible outlier in the story.
It really is. While the Abbasids are building these massive brick and stucco complexes in the east, the Umayyad dynasty, the ones who were overthrown, had one surviving prince who managed to escape the slaughter.
He flees all the way across North Africa and establishes a new kingdom in Spain.
And he brings that older Syrian stone and marble memory with him.
Spain becomes this fascinating time capsule and incubator.
Because the prince, Abd al-Rahman I, was surrounded by Syrian refugees who had also fled the Abbasids. The architecture they produced in Spain was a deliberate continuation of the Syrian aesthetic.
But they pushed it to entirely new extremes of complexity.
The ultimate manifestation of this is the Great Mosque of Cordova, which they started building in 786 AD.
When you look at the interior of Cordova, it doesn't look like anything in Samarra or even Damascus. It looks like an infinite forest of columns.
Some are smooth, some are fluted, but they are supporting something entirely unprecedented, double-tiered arcades.
The engineering behind that is quite ingenious.
They needed a high roof for grandeur and ventilation, but the columns they had salvaged from older Roman and Visigothic ruins were too short to support a roof at that height.
So they built arches on top of the columns, and then built another set of pillars and arches on top of those.
And they used alternating red brick and white stone in the arches, creating this hypnotic striped candy cane effect.
And as the Spanish kingdom grew wealthier, successive rulers just kept expanding it. You get minarets topped with apples of gold and silver.
You get domes in front of the prayer niche covered in the most complex, glittering gold mosaics. It's an aesthetic of sheer, overwhelming abundance.
And that Spanish Islamic tradition doesn't just stagnate. It refines itself over centuries, reaching its absolute zenith much later with the Alhambra in Granada.
By the time the Alhambra is built, we are looking at the absolute mastery of the environment.
It is an acropolis where the architecture and the climate are completely integrated.
I love how the texts describe the Alhambra. It's not just about building walls, it's about air conditioning through architecture.
Yeah, they designed airy halls specifically placed to catch the perfume of the surrounding gardens on the breeze.
They had absolute mastery over hydraulics, too. The fountains in the courtyards were engineered with such precise control over water pressure that they could make the water spout high into the air like a geyser.
Or just spread out in a perfectly flat, silent sheet to reflect the architecture like a mirror?
You have spaces like the Hall of Lions, with its 128 incredibly slender marble columns.
Supporting domes that are carved with stalactite-like structures, muqarnas that were originally painted in glowing gold, azure, and scarlet.
It was designed to feel ethereal, almost defying gravity.
Okay, so we have airy, gravity-defying palaces in Spain and massive stucco spirals in Iraq. But I want to pivot eastward for a second to Iran.
Because the timeline shows yet another completely different architectural language evolving there under the Seljuk Turks and later the Ilkhanid Mongols.
They seem obsessed with verticality.
Yeah. In Iran and Central Asia, the focus shifted heavily back to brickwork, but with structural engineering that pushed domes and towers to dizzying heights.
It was an architecture of dramatic profiles against the sky.
The prime example is the Gumbara Qabbas, built around 1006 AD in northern Iran.
It is a tomb tower, and the description of it is just so stark. It's this massive 10-pointed star-shaped cylinder made of baked brick, and it shoots straight up into the air over 167 feet.
And it's topped with this sharp, conical, tent-like roof.
But the craziest part, it's completely empty inside.
Just a massive, echoing void reaching up to that cone, built solely to house a single suspended coffin.
What were they going for with that design?
What you are seeing with the Gumbara Qabbas is the direct architectural translation of a nomadic tent.
Ah, right,
Yeah.
because the Turkic peoples originated in the Central Asian steppes, living in conical yurts and tents.
When they became sedentary rulers, they took the shape of their traditional temporary shelters and rendered them in permanent monumental brick.
It is a monument to their origins. And speaking of origins, we have to talk about the Mongols.
The historical reputation of the Mongols in the Islamic world is generally one of apocalyptic destruction.
Right, they sacked Baghdad, burned libraries, leveled cities.
But apparently, once they settled down and converted, they became incredibly prolific builders.
It is a remarkable historical pivot. The Ilkhanid Mongols went from destroying urban centers to obsessively planning them.
Kazan Khan, for example, built an entire perfectly axially planned city called Gazania, which was organized entirely around his own massive 12-sided tomb.
And his brother, Uljay II, built a new capital at Sultania.
The mausoleum he built there is considered one of the finest structural achievements of Mongol architecture.
Featuring a massive dome that was entirely covered in brilliant turquoise faience-glazed tile decoration.
So we've bounced from mud brick huts to optically twisted octagons to Roman bathhouses.
To spiral minarets, to candy cane arches in Spain, to massive tent towers in Iran. It's an insane breadth of styles.
It really is.
But as we established earlier, architecture is just the public face of an empire. It's the shell.
Right. If we truly want to understand the internal psychology, the deep-seated fears and philosophies of this culture, we have to walk through the doors of these buildings.
And look at what they put on the inside. And that brings us to their incredibly complicated, often contradictory relationship with painting.
To understand Muslim painting, you have to completely reset your expectations.
You have to understand the massive ideological handicap it started with. Early Islam didn't just ignore painting. It actively viewed it with profound suspicion.
There was a strict theological taboo against pictorial representation, specifically against drawing or sculpting living beings, humans, or animals.
And it's easy for a modern listener to view that as just, arbitrary puritanical censorship. But when you look at the historical context, it makes perfect sense.
Islam was born into a world battling pagan polytheism.
Exactly. In the pre-Islamic Arabian world, and indeed in much of the surrounding ancient world, beauty and idol worship were inextricably intertwined.
The aesthetic sense was essentially the religious sense. If you wanted to worship a deity or appease a spirit of nature, you carved a beautiful statue of it, or you painted its image.
The image was imbued with the power of the god.
So when Islam arrives with a strictly monotheistic message, arguing that there is only one unseen, unrepresentable God,
And that society should be based on reason and law, rather than appeasing stone idols, the visual arts become a direct threat.
you can't have people painting beautiful figures because human nature is going to eventually start worshiping those figures.
The aesthetic had to be violently subordinated to the moral.
As the text we're referencing points out, early Islam was inherently iconoclastic. Its initial artistic impulse wasn't about making images, it was about breaking them.
The destruction of idols was the foundational act of establishing the new theological order.
Which means that when a distinct Muslim tradition of painting finally does begin to emerge centuries later, it has completely severed ties with the classical Greco-Roman tradition of sculpting perfectly proportioned human bodies.
It evolves in total isolation from those older traditions, resulting in a visual DNA that is entirely unique.
It didn't follow the path of European Renaissance art, and it didn't follow the path of Chinese landscape art.
And the historians who analyze this period outline 5 very specific characteristics of this unique artistic DNA.
And the first one is perhaps the most foundational. Muslim painting grew directly out of calligraphy.
Because they couldn't paint people, all that pent-up artistic genius, that drive to create visual beauty, had to be channeled into something acceptable.
So they poured it into writing the Quran. They turned the written word into high art.
Therefore, the foundational unit of beauty wasn't shading or the illusion of mass, as it is in Western art.
The ultimate criterion of beauty was the cut, the line, the brushstroke itself.
A Western painter might use subtle gradients of shadow to make an apple look three-dimensional.
A Muslim painter, trained in the rigors of calligraphy, relied on the sheer vigor, the colorful confidence, and the sweeping rhythm of a single, forceful line to create form.
The mastery of the brushstroke was everything.
Okay, characteristic number 2 is really interesting because it deals with what they actually chose to paint once they started illustrating books.
The focus is intensely on human drama and human history.
And it's best understood by contrasting it with Chinese art from the same broad eras.
Right, because Chinese painters achieved immense maturity in these vast, sweeping landscapes. You'd have massive, misty mountains, rushing rivers, deep valleys.
And maybe, if you squint, one tiny little philosopher walking on a bridge in the corner.
But for the Muslim painter, that kind of painting was incomprehensible. A landscape devoid of human action or human symbols was considered dead, vacant, and insignificant.
In their philosophical framework, nature was not a dominant, overwhelming force to be passively contemplated. Nature had been subjugated by God to serve humanity.
Therefore, the human being, and specifically human deeds battles, the rise of dynasties, the building of cities, epic romances, must occupy the absolute center of the canvas.
The environment only exists as a stage for human action. The text says the scene must be perceived animistically with human warmth.
The rocks and trees are just props. The human drama is the point.
Precisely. Now, characteristic number 3 is the one that historically caused the most friction with Western art critics.
And it's perhaps the most philosophically profound: the total lack of three-dimensional perspective.
Yes. In a classical Muslim miniature painting, distance does not make things smaller. Objects that are supposed to be far away in the background are painted just as large and with just as much crisp detail as the objects in the immediate foreground.
Which, if you are trained in post-Renaissance Western art, where everything converges on a vanishing point, makes the painting look chaotic.
Right.
I used to look at these and think, wait, so if I'm looking at a painting of a siege and there's a guy in the back on a horse, he's the exact same size as the guy standing right in front of me. It just looks flat.
Western critics for a long time dismissed it exactly like that, as a lack of technical skill. They assumed the painters simply hadn't figured out geometry.
But that is completely false, isn't it?
It is completely false. These were the same people who were engineering the twisted octagons of the Dome of the Rock and mastering complex optical physics. They knew geometry perfectly well.
So it was a deliberate choice. But why?
Because three-dimensional perspective didn't fit their theology of time and reality?
Perspective is a trick of the eye. It's an optical illusion that anchors reality to a single, subjective human viewpoint at a single fraction of a second.
But the Muslim philosophical conception of time was vastly different. They believed that time and eternity are facets of the exact same reality.
All moments in time, past, present, and future, are equally present and visible before God.
Ah, so a human using a vanishing point is almost arrogant because it assumes the human eye is the center of reality.
Exactly. Why would an artist use a geometric trick to make some things seem distant and blurry and others close and sharp when, to the divine eye, everything is equally sharp and present?
To capture this, Muslim artists combined all dimensions and sometimes multiple phases of a story into a single simultaneous whole.
You might see a painting where a hero is setting out on a journey at the bottom of the page, fighting a monster in the middle, and returning victorious at the top, all happening at once, with no perspective to separate them.
It's almost like proto-cubism. It's an attempt to capture the eternal, simultaneous nature of reality, transcending linear time and geometric space.
It's not a lack of skill, it's a theological statement on canvas. That completely changes how you look at these pieces.
Okay, characteristic number 4. There are no dark shadows.
Everything is luminous, colorful, and bathed in an even light.
Again, we have to look to the psychology of the culture. In many artistic traditions, deep shadow and darkness represent the unknown, the primordial danger of the wilderness.
Or deep individualistic despair. Think of the heavy, oppressive shadows in a Rembrandt painting.
But the Muslim consciousness at this time, the text argues, was deeply and securely social.
The individual is a social being par excellence.
Exactly. They were part of a vast, confident, unified community. The absolute helplessness that leads to spiritual darkness, the terror of the pagan unknown, wasn't a central part of their worldview.
They felt secure in the divine order. So there is no room for dark, haunting shadows in their miniatures.
Every leaf on a tree, every pattern on a rug is painted with vivid, jewel-like clarity. Everything is alive and visible.
And the fifth characteristic is really the culmination of all these elements, and it's best seen in the work of the master painters of the Timurid and Safavid schools in Iran.
The text specifically highlights a painter named Behzad.
Behzad is a towering figure. Quandamir, a 16th century historian, wrote about him with absolute reverence.
He compared Behzad's brush to that of Mani, a legendary ancient painter who was believed to have performed miracles, saying that a single hair of Behzad's brush could give life to a lifeless form.
The text points to one of his masterpieces, The Dancing Dervishes, to prove that Muslim art isn't just pretty decorative illustration, it's deeply spiritual.
I want to describe this painting for you because it's stunning. It shows a group of Sufi dervishes in a courtyard, engaged in their ecstatic spinning dance.
But it's the composition that matters. They are arranged in a circle. And the text argues that this painting is a perfect mandala.
And we should clarify what a mandala is in this context. In Jungian psychology, a mandala is a geometric symbol of spiritual wholeness, a map of the integrated self.
In many traditions, the center of a mandala is an empty void, representing the unreachable divine. But in Behzad's painting, the center is not empty.
Right. The center is filled with 4 dervishes, arms linked, dancing hand in hand, anchored to the ground but spinning.
The argument is that Behzad wasn't just decorating a page in a book. He was responding to a profound spiritual need within his culture. He was visually mapping the state of mystical wholeness.
The endless sweeping curves of their robes and the powerful rhythmic lines of the calligraphy-influenced brushstrokes suggest physical movement, yes, but more importantly, they represent the soul's orbit around the divine center.
The painting is a tool for meditation. It's an orchestra of color and line.
But I have to stop here and ask for a reality check because my head is spinning a bit with the contradictions.
Yeah.
We started this entire exploration of painting by stating definitively that there was a strict, unyielding theological taboo against representing living things. It was iconoclastic.
Right.
Yet we just spent 20 minutes discussing Umayyad caliphs painting frescoes of naked bathers and defeated emperors at Qasr Amra, and now we are talking about Behzad painting incredibly detailed portraits of dancing dervishes.
How on earth do we reconcile this massive hypocrisy?
Yeah.
Was the rule just a suggestion?
It's a vital question, and it speaks to the reality of how human societies actually function versus how their laws are written.
Okay.
What we have to understand is the deep divide between the strict theological ideals enforced by the legists, the religious scholars, and the luxurious, often pragmatic realities of the royal courts.
So it was absolutely a do as I say, not as I do situation for the elite.
Essentially, yes. The theologians laid down the law, and in the highly public, strictly religious sphere, that law was absolute. You will never, ever find a human figure painted inside a mosque from this period.
The public space was fiercely protected from anything that even hinted at idolatry.
But the caliphs, the sultans, the affluent nobles, they lived in a different reality. In the privacy of their desert palaces or within the walls of their royal libraries, they patronized artists who pushed the boundaries.
And it's important to note where these later paintings, like Behzad's, were happening. They weren't hanging on the walls of public galleries. They were inside books.
Crucial point. This high painting tradition was intimately tied to literature.
They were illuminating copies of the Quran initially with geometric patterns, but eventually they began illustrating secular literary classics, epic Persian poetry like the Shahnameh or Nizami's romantic epics.
These books were incredibly expensive to produce and were kept in private, restricted access royal libraries. The general public never saw them.
So the threat of these images causing mass idolatry was considered non-existent.
And there's a philosophical justification for tying the art to the book, too. The text points out that for the Muslim mind, nature itself is viewed as an illustration of the Word of God.
The ultimate creative act is the divine command, kun fayakun be, and it is.
Exactly. The eternal Word and its physical manifestation are intrinsically linked. So for the artist, visual art was naturally subservient to text.
The painter was visually translating the written words that provided spiritual or historical sustenance.
But despite this loophole for book illustration, the reality remained that large-scale public fine arts like monumental sculpture or massive public frescoes were generally frowned upon by the wider society.
Which creates a massive bottleneck for creative energy. If you are a brilliant, once-in-a-generation artistic genius living in 10th century Baghdad or 12th century Cairo, you can't just set up a studio and start carving marble statues for the town square.
You'd be arrested.
So where does all that genius go? It doesn't just disappear.
It doesn't disappear. It gets diverted. And this brings us to perhaps the most impactful aesthetic shift of all.
Because the traditional major fine arts were restricted, the immense overflowing aesthetic energy of this civilization was poured into the objects of everyday life.
They elevated what art historians traditionally call the minor arts to breathtaking, unprecedented heights.
I have such a problem with that term, minor arts. It feels so dismissive.
It does.
It's like constraint bred the ultimate creativity. I look at it like the early days of social media, when Twitter had a strict 140-character limit. You couldn't write a novel, so people had to invent an entirely new, incredibly sharp, punchy style of communication.
You had to be brilliant within a very tight box.
Calling pottery, textiles, and bookbinding minor arts in this context is like calling modern UI and UX design minor, when it is literally the primary interface through which we interact with the modern digital world.
That is a remarkably apt modern analogy. They were coding the visual environment of the society.
Let's look at the primary interface, which we touched on earlier, calligraphy. It wasn't just a way to record information. It became an independent, highly revered, abstract art form in its own right.
The evolution of the Arabic script is a testament to this. It started with the Kufic script, which was very angular, rigid, and monumental, perfect for carving into stone or writing the very earliest heavy parchment copies of the Quran.
But then it needs to become more fluid, so you get Naskh, which is rounded and cursive, much faster to write.
But the absolute pinnacle of this art form, according to the historians, happens much later under the Timurid dynasty in Iran, with the invention of a script called Nastaliq.
The text describes Nastaliq as a blend of the cursive Naskh and another script called Taliq. But what does it actually look like? Because the descriptions treat it like a magical invention.
Nastaliq is characterized by short vertical strokes and incredibly long, sweeping horizontal strokes. It looks as though the words are gently sloping downward from right to left, almost as if the text is floating or drifting across the page.
It manages to combine strict geometric proportion with a feeling of effortless elegance, vigor, and charm. It was credited to a calligrapher named Mir Ali of Tabriz.
And it becomes such a dominant art form that later, under the Safavid dynasty, a calligrapher named Mir Imad Khatib perfects Nastaliq to such an extreme degree that his actual name became synonymous with the concept of beautiful writing.
These calligraphers weren't anonymous craftsmen. They were superstars. They were as famous, wealthy, and celebrated as any major architect or painter.
Because they were visually manifesting the divine word, and naturally, if the writing is sacred, the vehicle holding the writing must be equally magnificent.
This led to bookbinding evolving from a simple utilitarian craft meant to protect parchment into a high art form.
The techniques they developed for bookbinding are insane. They didn't just wrap cardboard and leather.
They would take the covers and apply a fine plaster or gesso to build up a raised three-dimensional surface. Then they would paint intricate scenes or geometric patterns with watercolors directly onto the plaster.
And finally, seal the whole thing under multiple protective layers of clear lacquer.
It resulted in book covers that looked like gleaming, polished jewels.
And this highlights a major theme of our deep dive: cross-pollination. The source notes that this specific Iranian lacquered bookbinding technique didn't stay in Iran.
It traveled via trade routes to Venice, where it directly inspired Venetian bookbinders, eventually shaping the aesthetic of broader European luxury bookbinding during the Renaissance.
Which is a perfect segue to talk about the physical movement of these crafts, because the geopolitics of art during this period are fascinating. The artisans were not static.
Let's look at pottery. The Muslim potters completely transformed the craft of ceramics.
Early on, they inherited basic glazing techniques from the Mediterranean and the Asiatic hinterland, But then they developed something entirely new, almost like alchemy, luster painting.
Lusterware is a brilliant example of scientific innovation serving an aesthetic need. It's a highly complex chemical process.
You take a piece of glazed pottery that has already been fired once. Then you paint patterns on it using metallic oxides, copper or silver mixed with sulfur and an acid.
You fire it a second time in a special kiln that starves the fire of oxygen, a process called reduction.
The carbon in the smoke pulls the oxygen out of the metallic paint, leaving behind a microscopically thin film of pure, gleaming metal fused to the glaze.
The result is a piece of clay that shines with this iridescent metallic glow, shifting colors in the light. It looks like solid gold or silver, but it's just clay.
And this is where the geopolitics come in. The secret of this luster technique seems to have originated in Mesopotamia, in the great Abbasid capital of Samarra. But the artists didn't stay there.
No, because artisans are tied to patronage. When the Abbasid power in Samarra began to wane and the economy faltered, a new, incredibly wealthy dynasty, the Fatimids, rose to power in Egypt.
So what did the master potters do? They packed up their closely guarded trade secrets and migrated to Cairo.
They followed the money. And in Cairo, they didn't just repeat what they did in Iraq. They vastly improved the technique, creating some of the most vibrant lusterware in history.
But then the Fatimid dynasty eventually collapses in the 12th century. The patronage dries up again.
So those artists pack up again, and this time they migrate to Iran, specifically setting up a massive ceramics hub in the city of Kashan, bringing their highly evolved luster techniques with them.
It's a perfect illustration of how technology and styles spread through the Islamic world. The artists migrate to stability, and the innovations compound with every move.
And when they got to Iran, they encountered a new aesthetic challenge: Chinese porcelain.
The Silk Road trade was bringing in vast quantities of this incredibly fine white Chinese pottery, which was highly prized by the elites.
And the Iranian potters realized they couldn't physically make porcelain because they didn't have the right kind of clay kaolin.
But they were brilliant enough to invent a new composite material, fritware, to fake it. They essentially created a synthetic porcelain.
But the source makes a really wonderful observation about the style. The Iranian potters started out imitating the Chinese designs, but the historian notes that while genuine Chinese art of that period can sometimes feel a bit stiff or formalized, the Muslim potters adapted it to be easy, harmonious, and well-bred.
They infused it with their own sweeping rhythms derived from calligraphy.
And eventually, under rulers like Shah Abbas, they gained enough confidence to drop the Chinese imitations entirely and developed a truly original Iranian landscape style for their pottery, completely distinct from their influences.
We see this exact same pattern of massive, empire-spanning industry and innovation in textiles.
The text talks about the Tiraz factories. These were essentially state-run textile mills established across the empires.
Under the Abbasids, you had silks and fine linens being woven in places like Merv and Nishapur in Central Asia, taking ancient Sasanian techniques of weaving gold thread and blending them with Egyptian Coptic motifs.
The Fatimids in Egypt took it in a different direction, producing these incredibly sheer linens that were actually stamped with intricate patterns of liquid gold.
Later, the Safavid silks in Iran were so finely woven that they could depict entire complex scenes from Persian romances like the Shahnameh woven directly into the fabric of a garment. You were literally wearing literature.
And this textile dominance stretches all the way into India. The text mentions the Mughal empires producing incredibly fine woven cashmere shawls and these massive block-printed cottons, which became highly desired in Europe under the name palampors.
But whether we are talking about carved wood in Egypt, carved ivory in Spain, inlaid metalwork in Syria, or silk in Iran, there is one supreme, unifying decorative concept that cuts across all these media.
It is the visual signature of the Islamic world, the arabesque. The text mentions it constantly, as if it's the solution to every artistic problem they had. What exactly is the deep philosophical driver behind the arabesque? It's not just a pretty doodle, right?
Far from it. The arabesque is arguably the most profound visual manifestation of Islamic theology. Physically, it is an abstract, geometric, or highly stylized floral pattern that seems to intertwine, branch out, and repeat infinitely across a surface.
It has no beginning and no end.
Exactly. And that is its philosophical purpose. It perfectly solved the tension we discussed earlier. It satisfied the strict religious need to avoid representing human or animal figures while simultaneously fulfilling the deep human need for complex, mesmerizing, mathematically perfect beauty.
When you look at an arabesque, Your eye is drawn into an infinite loop. It cannot rest on a single focal point.
It suggests the infinite, unnameable nature of God, the endless interconnectedness of the universe without ever defining a specific idolatrous form. It is the infinite made visible through geometry.
That is incredibly cool. It's a visual representation of eternity. But visual art, whether it's the geometry of a mosque or the infinite loops of an arabesque, is only half the sensory equation. Humans don't just look at the world, we listen to it.
And just as calligraphy was the visual expression of the divine word, there was an auditory expression that caused an immense amount of societal debate. Music.
Music is perhaps the most contested space in Muslim philosophy and society during this era. And understanding it requires holding two opposing ideas in your head at the same time.
Right, because how do you take the mathematical precision and the theological strictness of the visual arts we've been discussing and apply it to something as emotional and invisible as sound?
The text outlines a really complex relationship. On one extreme, you have the strict legists, the Orthodox scholars, who heavily opposed music. They combed through traditions and declared it an unlawful invention, a distraction from piety, something associated with taverns and immorality.
But on the completely opposite side of the spectrum, you have the philosophers, the scientists, and the Sufi mystics who embraced music deeply, seeing it not as a distraction, but as a direct bridge to the divine and a manifestation of the mathematical perfection of the universe.
The text quotes a group called the Ikhwan al-Safa, the Brethren of Purity. They were this fascinating, almost secret society of philosophers operating in 10th century Basra in Iraq. They wrote encyclopedias on everything, including music.
And they argued that while all the other arts, architecture, painting, pottery have physical, bodily forms, the substance of music is a spiritual essence.
They viewed music as the most pure art form because it wasn't tied to physical matter. It was pure vibration.
I loved their analogy. They wrote, to some people, music is like food. To others, it is like medicine. And to others, like a fan. They were incredibly pragmatic about its power.
They recognized that it could be used to heal psychological and physical disease in hospitals. It could ease the toil of heavy labor for workers, and it could bring sudden, profound penitence to a hardened heart.
And this idea of music acting directly on the soul was taken to its absolute limit by the great theologian and philosopher Al-Ghazali. He had a profound respect for the psychological power of sound.
He described the human heart as a mine of secrets, with precious jewels hidden deep inside, like sparks trapped within a piece of flint.
And he called music the flint that strikes the heart to extract those hidden secrets. He wrote, listening to music is a factual touchstone. It brings out whatever predominates in the soul.
That is such a modern psychological way to describe the emotional impact of a song. If your soul is dominated by sadness, music will make you weep. If you're joyful, it makes you dance. It doesn't put the emotion into you, it draws out what is already there.
And for the Sufis, the Islamic mystics, this wasn't just about experiencing human emotion, it was an applied spiritual technology. They practiced something called al-sama, which translates to spiritual listening.
They used specifically composed music, rhythms, and chanting as a mechanism to bypass the rational mind, achieve a state of spiritual ecstasy, and experience a direct intuitive revelation of the divine presence.
But again, we run into this massive split between the high theological theory of the mystics and the grounded, often hedonistic reality of the secular courts. Because while the legists are debating if a lute is a sin, the Umayyad and Abbasid courts in Damascus and Baghdad are absolutely packed with musical virtuosos.
It was the pop culture of the day, and the text makes a huge point about the incredible diversity in these courts. The musicians weren't just local Arabs, they were of Persian, Turkish, Berber, and African descent. The expanding empires absorbed everyone.
Yes, the Islamic territories at this time knew very few racial boundaries when it came to talent. If you were a genius musician, the court wanted you. This incredible mixing pot led to a massive influx of new musical instruments, new scales, and new tuning systems.
The Arabs adopted the Persian chang, which is a complex harp, and the sharud, an elaborate arch lute that was reportedly invented in Samarkand. They were constantly experimenting with new ways to make sound.
And it wasn't just about playing tunes, they treated music as hardcore empirical science. They were obsessed with acoustics.
We mentioned the Ikhwan al-Safa earlier. The text points out something that blew my mind. In the 10th century, they were writing treatises explaining that the loudness of a sound depends not just on the amplitude of the vibration, but on the quantity of air that is being forced into vibration by the instrument.
Which is a highly advanced acoustic principle. As the source notes, they were articulating this concept nearly 800 years before European physicists like Hermann von Helmholtz were debating and formalizing the exact same aerodynamic principles of sound.
And you have massive intellectual heavyweights like Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina Avicenna writing definitive, highly mathematical treatises on music theory. They were mapping rhythm and tuning systems, rooting their work in ancient Greek Pythagorean traditions, but vastly expanding and correcting them based on their own empirical experiments with lutes.
They viewed music as a branch of mathematics, intrinsically linked to astronomy and the mathematical order of the cosmos.
So here's my driving question for this entire section. How on earth does society manage to hold these two extremes simultaneously without tearing itself apart? You have strict legists standing in the mosque declaring music an unlawful invention that will rot your soul. And literally right next door in the same city, you have brilliant scientists mapping the aerodynamic physics of sound waves and Sufi mystics using those exact same sound waves to literally try and talk to God.
It sounds like a society functioning with a massive, beautiful, but highly productive cognitive dissonance. How did they not just ban it all, or conversely, let it completely take over?
It's a profound observation, and it cuts to the core of why this civilization was so successful. I think it shows that Islamic civilization during this golden age wasn't the monolithic, single-minded entity that modern people often assume it was. It was a highly dynamic, incredibly intellectual society that was capable of sustaining fierce, open internal debates.
The scientists were deeply interested in mapping the physical laws of God's universe. The mystics were entirely focused on the internal spiritual connection to God, and the legists were focused on maintaining the external moral order of society.
They were all investigating the exact same truth, but from entirely different angles. And the tension between those angles, the push and pull between law, science, and spirit, is precisely what produced such a rich, resilient cultural output.
And that rich output, that massive synthesis of art, science, and spirit, didn't just stay neatly contained within the borders of the Muslim empires. It leaked out. It created a ripple effect that quite literally changed the entire globe. Which brings us to the final piece of our deep dive: global resonance.
The physical export of these arts is perhaps their most enduring legacy. The Islamic world didn't just hoard its discoveries. It acted as a massive cultural distribution network. Let's look westward first to Spain and Europe.
The Moors, the Muslims of North African and Arab descent, made up at least a tenth of the population of the Iberian Peninsula for centuries. And their presence wasn't just a military occupation, it was a cultural overwhelming. Their art, their architecture with the candy cane arches we talked about, and especially their music, completely captivated the surrounding Christian kingdoms.
The intellectual transfer was massive. The text highlights that complex treatises on music and acoustics written by Andalusian thinkers like Ibn Rushd's, known in the West as Averroes, and his commentary on Aristotle's work on sound were highly sought after.
They were translated from Arabic into Hebrew and critically into Latin. The Latin translation by scholars like Michael Scott became incredibly influential in European universities, laying the groundwork for Western acoustic science.
But the cultural transfer survived, even when the politics turned violently hostile. The text notes that after the fall of Granada in 1492, the Spanish priesthood initiated a ruthless persecution of the remaining Moors. They banned their traditional dress, they banned the Arabic language, and they specifically outlawed their musical gatherings, the Zumra and the Laila, where they played lutes and sang traditional poetry.
They tried to legislate the culture out of existence, but it was too late. Despite the bans and the Inquisition, the Moorish musical forms, the rhythms, the instruments like the lute, which literally derives its name from the Arabic alud, had already permanently seeped into the bedrock of European music. You cannot understand the development of Renaissance music without understanding the Arabic influence that came through Spain.
And the influence flowed just as powerfully eastward, too. We talked about the Mongols earlier and how they initially destroyed everything in their path, but the text points out the unintended consequence of the Mongol conquests. They created the largest contiguous land empire in human history.
And by doing so, they opened up entirely secure, heavily guarded trade routes, all the way from Persia straight into the heart of China.
Yes, the Pax Mongolica. By the time of the Yuan dynasty in China, founded by Kublai Khan, you had massive contingents of Turkestani soldiers, Persian administrators, and Arab merchants living permanently in Chinese cities and serving in the imperial courts.
And with them, inevitably, came Muslim musicians and artisans.
The text actually lists the specific instruments they introduced to the court in Beijing. The Chinese orchestras adopted the surnay, which is a type of oboe, the rabab, a bowed string instrument, and the kopuz, a lute. They literally changed the sound of Chinese imperial music.
It highlights a crucial concluding point. Muslim art and science was never a closed loop. Because the empire geographically spanned from the Atlantic coast of Spain all the way to the borders of China, it acted as the ultimate cultural synthesizer of the medieval world.
I look at it like the ultimate multi-century open-source software project. A new musical scale or a breakthrough in the chemistry of pottery glazing is developed and uploaded by a genius in Baghdad.
A few decades later, it gets patched, refined, and improved by a guild of artisans in Cairo.
And a century after that, it gets downloaded and executed in the imperial courts of Beijing and the Renaissance workshops of Venice. It's a massive, borderless collaboration.
That is exactly what happened. They absorbed Greek acoustics, Roman hypocausts, Persian architecture, Egyptian glassmaking, and Indian textiles. They didn't just copy them, they refined them all through the highly specific, mathematically rigorous lens of Islamic theology, and then they exported that newly synthesized culture to the entire globe.
So if we look back at the journey we've taken today, the sheer scale of the transformation is breathtaking. We started with the harsh reality of mud brick huts and camel hair tents in the blazing desert. Within a few generations, we were walking through the mathematically perfect, optically twisted, concentric octagons of the Dome of the Rock and staring up at the towering 50-meter spiral of the Malwiya in Samarra.
We saw how a strict, unyielding theological taboo against idolatry forced artists to abandon the easy tricks of 3D perspective and deep shadow, leading to the vibrant, time-bending, eternal masterpieces of painters like Behzad, where the forceful stroke of the line itself became the ultimate measure of beauty.
We watched brilliant minds, restricted from making massive public statues, channel their constrained energies into the objects of daily life. They turned bookbinding into a jeweled art. They used chemistry to make clay shine like solid gold and lusterware pottery, and they connected everything with the infinite mesmerizing geometric loops of the arabesque.
And we heard the intense societal debates over the nature of music, ranging from the mathematical science of aerodynamics mapped by the Brethren of Purity to the spiritual ecstasy of Al-Ghazali using music as a flint to strike the hidden secrets of the human heart.
And finally, we traced how this massive cultural synthesis flowed outward, irreversibly shaping the acoustics of Renaissance Europe and the orchestras of Imperial China. But as we wrap up, I know you always like to leave us with a broader application. What is the final thought we should take away from all of this?
Today, in our modern, highly specialized world, we have a very strong tendency to strictly compartmentalize our lives and our knowledge. We put science in one box, we put art in a separate gallery, and we put religion or philosophy in another building entirely. We often view them as distinct, sometimes even opposing silos. But the true brilliance of the Muslim fine arts, as we've explored in this deep dive, came from their absolute refusal to separate those disciplines.
Right, they didn't see the boundaries. They were all completely interconnected.
Exactly. For them, a mosque wasn't just a quiet place to pray. It was simultaneously an architectural feat of cutting-edge engineering. It was a sprawling canvas for the mathematical geometric art of calligraphy and the infinite arabesque. And it was a precisely calculated, highly engineered acoustic space designed to carry the science of the divine word. The science served the art, and the art served the spirit. They were inextricable. So, the question I want to leave you to mull over is this. What could we achieve today if we stop viewing our technological, artistic, and spiritual pursuits as separate competing fields and instead saw them exactly as they did, as different, mutually reinforcing expressions of the exact same truth?
That is a phenomenal question. Imagine treating modern software coding or urban city planning, or the music we produce, not just as isolated commercial disciplines, but as interconnected facets of the same overarching reality. It makes you want to look at the buildings you walk past, the books on your shelf, and the music you listen to with a completely new, integrated perspective. We've come a very long way from those mud brick hovels, but the philosophy they built out of the desert is still incredibly relevant. I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the history of Muslim philosophy and fine arts. Keep looking closely at the world around you, keep listening deeply, and we'll see you next time.